Hey guys, welcome back to the second part of this tutorial series, and in this part I'm going to start off by giving you some tips on how you can create simple flowers and leaves in your watercolour paintings, because especially with nature, a lot of the time the animal is in a natural environment which may have plants or flowers, branches, all of that sort of stuff, and it also adds as like nice background sort of objects for your animal paintings. So with plants and branches and sort of flowers and everything like that, I don't want it normally to be the focal point of the painting. It's meant to be about the animal. But you want to get the impression of those flowers and those plants in. And so what I try to do is I try to keep it nice and simple. And so as you can see, when I'm doing the leaves, the main thing that you want to do to not make it too realistic and too much of the focus is to not add too much detail. So for example, I like to block in the shapes of the leaves, the shapes of the petals, and add these little lines to represent like the stems or little bits of grass or anything like that. And so I get the main shapes in, but I don't go in and add lots of little veins or lots of shading. I like to add the main shapes and then just splotch in some other colours, maybe add some splatters, and that's about it. And so what this will give you is the impression, so you kind of know what those things are meant to be. You know they're meant to be petals, and you know they're like foliage and a branch, but it's not like super realistic, and it fits the style of the bird nice. So you pretty much do it in the same way you do the bird. With the bird, we were looking at the colours, we looked at the sort of shadows and everything, but we're not trying to add loads of detail, all of the little feathers. We're just trying to get in the shapes and the main important parts that make up the anatomy of the animal. So you can see for the petals here, with the pink petals, I'm just doing the shapes. Some of the petals I'm doing lighter than others, just to give a bit of variety. And that's really important. Otherwise, this can start to look, because you're not doing too much detail, it can easily look not low quality, but too simple. And so I like to create a bit of variety to my petals. And so what often I like to do is I like to add a very light wash and just mark in all of the petals. And then if you want to darken some up whilst it's still wet, you can just go and drop more concentrated versions of that colour or different colours to the petals. And so if you want a stronger version of a certain colour, then just don't add as much water when you're trying to mix it together. So like I'm doing now, you can see that I'm adding little dots of the darker pink for the darkest parts of the petal, and it just makes it a little more interesting rather than them all being just one flat colour. But you can see that I'm not doing it necessarily to every single petal. And so now I'm going in and I'm adding the little bit of green between them, and again still not adding too much detail, using one colour, just marking it all in for the moment. And again, I'm looking at the reference, I'm looking at the sort of amount and where the greenery is around the petals, but I'm not following it exactly. With the loose paintings, you don't have to be really exact to the reference image. You do a bit more with the animal, with the anatomy, but with plants and flowers, there's so much sort of variety anyway that you can be a lot more loose and natural when you're doing these, because of the fact that there are a lot of different ways the leaves can look and the petals can flow and all of that sort of stuff. So really just have fun with it when you're painting the flowers and the foliage and all of that sort of stuff. So I'm just finishing this little bit off, just tweaking stuff. And this doesn't take too long. I find that the backgrounds don't take me a long time because I don't want them to be the focus. So I just try and keep it nice and loose. And again, I was bleeding some of those petals into the background. I like to bleed out some of the colours so it doesn't all just look harsh with the harsh edges. I like to have a mixture between harsh edges and then bled out edges. With the branch, you can see that mainly that branch that's going up is quite a harsh edge, but on the bottom of the main branch you can see a lot of that is bled out, and that is just because it gives it more of a loose look. It looks more loose because it's not uniformed, it's not really harsh edges, they're bleeding out, the colours are merging, there's lots of different colours in there. And so you want to try and get a nice balance with your background and with your animal and main subject of your harsh edges and then your more bled out edges. So I'm just going through and adding some more of the leaves and everything like that to the bottom part, just under the branch. You can add more or you can add less than the reference image. You can adjust the reference image and add more colours if the petals are a certain colour but you want to change that. Then go ahead and change it. With this technique and this style, there is so much more room to be like really creative with it. Change colours, change the way the petals look. Add more petals if you want to and more flowers, or add less. It's up to you. You don't have to be as strict as you do with, say, realism. You can be a lot more creative and loose and really just do kind of what you want, what you're feeling. Now let's move on to our second technique for this video, and that is leaving white space. It's so important to preserve the areas that you want to keep for your highlights. If you find that you've added watercolour to these areas by mistake, then one good tip that I have for you guys is use some kitchen towel or tissue, something like that, and if the watercolour is still wet and it hasn't dried yet, you can actually just lift that colour straight off there with a tissue, just by blotting a nice clean dry tissue onto there. If it's wet, it will just lift it completely off. If it's a particularly dark colour, then you might have a bit of a light stain, but the majority of the time it really does lift it quite well. And so when you've got your painting, it's very important with watercolours to preserve your white areas in your painting that you want to keep the brightest, because even though you can go in, as I will do later, and add highlights, you don't really want to do this for large areas. And especially with watercolour work, it's important to keep that white space just to add the contrast, because the white actual watercolour paint isn't very good, and also it kind of gets rid of all of our nice crisp edges and, you know, our watercolour effect if we then try and go in and add all of the white space with paint again, and it just won't get it as bright. So I always try to think about where I want my lightest areas to be in a painting, and I try to preserve them. I always want to try and preserve a decent amount of white space, and I feel like a lot of people, when they're starting using watercolours, they feel like they need to do a wash over the whole entire piece and just paint everywhere, when really you don't have to do that. You can preserve white space, look at your reference image and pick out the lightest areas in that piece and preserve them. You can always go in later and darken them up if you feel like you really want to, but I always try to preserve areas. As you can see below the branch, there's a lot of white space. Same with on the actual bird. I use white space to get in the highlights quite a lot of the time, so I don't do too much with the gouache after with the white highlights. Most of the time I preserve them already, so they're already there. It can be difficult, especially if you're using wet in wet techniques and bleeding out methods, to try and keep areas white, so you might have to go in and use white gouache if you've kind of lost them already. But you can see for like parts of the feathers, I've left little strips of white areas just to get in that contrast and those cool sort of textures and effects, whereas if I had completely covered the whole of the bird and the body and then tried to go in with the white gouache and pull up all those highlights, it might do it and it do it okay, but you'd lose that natural watercolour edge that you've got from watercolours, and so it would kind of lose the look of a nice watercolour painting. So with the background, I also try to leave more white space because I want to try and keep the background a bit more minimal. So I try not to add watercolour everywhere, otherwise I think it's going to be a bit too much. So I'm just adding little bits of flowers, little bits of leaves, but I'm not going too overboard. And that's something you really need to think about. You need to think when you're doing a watercolour painting that it's going to be quite loose and quite like, yeah, very loose. You want to make sure that you're planning where things are going in a way, because if you're doing a loose painting, there's going to be a lot of colours bleeding out, and you want to make sure you're also keeping that control and that you're doing it in an intentional way. You're bleeding out colours in an intentional way. Obviously, there's going to be some sort of spontaneous things that you're going to do, like the splatters and everything, but most of the time you want to think about the colours that you're going to use, because with watercolour, it can be hard to reverse that process. If you mix colours that you don't really want to, it can be easy if you're using the wet and wet method to start dropping lots of colours in, and then they do all sort of merge into one muddy colour, and that's something that you don't want to happen. So even though you can be very loose with this, you also want to give it some thought before you start to the colours that you're going to use, like the main colour and then other pops of colours that you want to add. Where do you want the splatters to mainly be? For example, with my kingfisher bird with like the fish in its mouth that I did a while ago, I actually went in and added splatters all around the wings because the fish was coming out of the water, and I thought the splatters would really help with that motion and give it more of an interesting look. So that is it for today's part, guys, and I'll see you in the next part when we will finally go through the things that I do sometimes after I've finished the watercolour process, just to enhance the painting a bit more and kind of just do the style that I like to for my watercolour paintings. Bye, guys.